2021 Plan Commission and Commission for Citizen Involvement meeting. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Iris, would you please call the roll?
Buchanan?
Here.
Heap?
Here.
Leak is excused. Pepe?
Here.
Phillips is excused. Rigsby?
Here.
Rigby. Okay. Stewart?
Here.
Thank you, Iris. We have quorum. So first on the agenda tonight is a council update. I don't believe we'll have a council update, so we'll move on to public comment. This is regarding issues not on the agenda. Iris, was there anyone who wished to make a public comment tonight?
No.
Move on then to the Commission for Citizen Involvement, general updates. We did receive one email regarding the Commission for Citizen Involvement and goals. We'll discuss that in our work session on goals. Other than that, I had no items for Commission for Citizen Involvement today. So next we'll move on to the minutes. These are the minutes for October 25th, 2021, November 8th, 2021, and November 22nd, 2021. I guess I'd like to ask the commissioners if they have any clarifications, changes that they would like to request for any of the minutes. Otherwise, maybe we can make a motion to approve all three minutes. Commissioners, any changes? Yeah.
I would need to abstain on the last one because I wasn't here. So
All right, we
have to
can
call it separately.
All right, we can do the first two then, and then the third separate.
I would need to abstain from the 25th. Sorry,
Okay,
Robert.
so we'll
We can need to do
do them
piecemeal.
individually. I was trying to make it go a little bit faster, but all right. Any changes to the October 25th, 2021 meeting minutes?
No, I move for approval.
There's a motion to approve the October 25th, 2021 meeting minutes. Is there a second?
I'd like to second that.
There's a motion to approve in a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I wasn't there, so I'll abstain.
All right, one abstain. Any nays? None? All right.
I abstain as well on the 25th.
All right, so 2 abstains and 3 approvals. The minutes are approved for October 25th. Okay, the meeting minutes for November 8th, 2021. Any changes, clarifications, or is there a motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Any commissioner would like to make a second?
Second.
Thank you, Vice Chair Pepe. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any abstains?
I'll abstain for the same reason.
1 abstain. Any nays? None. All right, the minutes are approved. Next are the minutes for November 22nd, 2021. Motion to approve the minutes for November 22nd, 2021.
I move to approve.
There's a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any
Aye.
abstain? Any abstains?
Yes, abstain.
1 abstain. 3 approvals. Any nays? No. The minutes are approved. Thank you, commissioners. The next item on the agenda is a work session. This is item 7.1, Planning Commission and Commission for Citizen Involvement Goals 2022, work session number 2. Public comments are accepted. The commission will review and finalize potential 2022 goals for city council consideration. The staff coordinator is Scot Siegel, and the community development director. Iris, just to check in, is there anybody that would like to make a public comment on this agenda item tonight?
Yes.
All right, so noted. Director Siegel, would you like to give us an introduction?
Thank you, Chair Heap. Good evening, members of the Planning Commission. This study session follows your October 25th meeting where the Planning Commission
Thanks.
reviewed your work plan from 2021 and you discussed projects and initiatives that we should be planning for in 2022. Commission had some specific questions or some research that you asked staff to follow up on. That's summarized in the staff report. One request from the commission was that you wanted to see a work program or a little bit more detail on the proposal by the Palisades Neighborhood Association to develop an overlay zone for a portion of their neighborhood. So staff worked with representatives of the neighborhood association to better understand their goals for the project and to see how the city could assist the neighborhood as their work is already underway. And so the outline that's attached to the staff memo describes sort of a high-level scope and schedule for how we might go about doing that. The main takeaway there is that we really don't have the capacity, and I don't believe the Planning Commission will have a capacity in the first part of the year to do really intensive work on this as far as work sessions or facilitating a public engagement process, but there is quite a bit of work that the neighborhood association could do of their own accord that we can assist with in the background. So that's what is described in the scope, the outline, and I believe a representative of the neighborhood association is here this afternoon if you have any questions. It is evening, it's not afternoon, is it? The second item related to the Lake Grove Village Center and West Lake Grove Design District, and this is a continuation of the work that the city is doing mainly through the efforts of the Lake Grove Business Association and in coordination with the neighborhood associations in Lake Grove to propose updates to the design district standards in those two sub-areas, focusing on building design materials, detailing, and more of the aesthetic standards that apply to that area. And the commission wanted to know what their estimated timeline was, and so I did speak with the chair, or actually the president of the Lake Grove Business Association, Mr. Sandblast, who indicated that by the spring of this year, March or April, they would anticipate being prepared to come before you and present their concepts for updating the code. So in the forecast that we've drafted and that Ms. McCaleb handed out, that's reflected in the forecast. You'll see that work would pick up beginning in the spring, but really in earnest later in the year with public hearings following our work on House Bill 2001. The fourth item was just a request for the commissioners if you had any specific items that you wanted to discuss this evening to bring those forward. And we did receive one request from the chair that I believe you'll be addressing as you get into your discussions this evening about code enforcement, I believe was the topic. So the staff memo on pages 2 and 3, what we attempted to do is just summarize the work that we are aware of, that we're committed to doing, that's either mandated by the state or is a continuation of the work that we're already doing with the community, and listed those projects here with some general timelines and with consideration for meeting the requirements of House Bill 2001, and then following on with some of the other work as we complete that scope. So probably the easiest way to really kind of wade into this discussion would be to look at the draft forecast, if that's helpful, or the staff memo, just to get a sense of timing and the scale of each of these efforts. I think it's fair to say that the work on House Bill 2001, including the sort of adjunct task or request from the council that we consider a new definition of demolition as part of that obviously would go well beyond what's necessary, or it's not a requirement of the state, but it would have applicability to middle housing as well as other development in the community if you were to recommend changes to that definition. There is more work required by the state once we've completed our task on House Bill 2001. There are mandates under House Bill 2003 that we update our housing needs analysis, which was last updated in 2013, and that we do that by 2023. And then within 1 year of having adopted an updated housing needs analysis, the city must prepare and approve a housing production strategy, which is really the kind of project delivery on that needed housing, whether it's income targeted housing or other housing needs. And so that body of work will take us well into 2024, which of course isn't shown on this forecast, but we wanted to track it, as I think there's some work for the commission to do during the probably the last quarter of 2022 on scoping that and providing some direction to staff on the process that we would want to use to develop that housing needs analysis, and including public engagement. So even though that work isn't due until probably the end of 2023, or at least the first phase of that work, we'll need to start the procurement process and going out for proposals if we're going to use any outside services, which I anticipate we will. So that is it. I mean, the other work that I was describing here is all charted on the forecast. The projects that are highlighted in yellow are those that either require council direction, for example, the economic development strategy that the council is considering at this time presently, or projects that would be scoped and really subject to state requirements. And those are the two items, or actually just one item that we're proposing be consolidated with our work under the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan, and that is the set of rules that the state's developing for climate-friendly and equitable communities. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that or any of these other projects if you would like. Otherwise, I'll conclude my presentation and
All right, thank you,
turn it back
Director
to you,
Siegel.
Chair. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioners, any questions for staff? All right, I think we can come back if we have questions. Otherwise, at this time, I know we have folks who would like to make public comment. So I'd like to open it up for the public comment at this time. Iris, would you please call the first person who would like to comment tonight?
Certainly, Mr. Chris Durkee.
Thank you, Mr. Durkee. If you'd like to state your name and address for the record, and please give your comments.
Yes, hello. My name is Chris Durkee. I live at 2356 Glen Haven Road in the Palisades neighborhood. Thank you for letting me come tonight.
Mr. Durkee, are you representing any organization tonight?
No, speaking for myself.
Okay.
Thank you for letting me come tonight. I don't have any extensive prepared comments, but I do want to urge you to carefully consider and approve setting the overlay district for Palisades as a goal for next year. We've worked very closely with Director Siegel and his staff, and we so appreciate their cooperation in the midst of this staggering task of rewriting our community development code for HB 2001. I know that's an enormous undertaking, but I think we've developed together a good work plan that does not overly burden their staff in the first half of next year, which is when most of the heavy lifting for the new community development code is going to happen. And then during that 6 months, we've got a lot to do at the neighborhood level, and then after that, we'll get more involved with the staff. So I just wanted you to know this is really important to us, and we really appreciate Director Siegel and Erik and their willingness to work with us and in a collaborative fashion to help us get this overlay done, but not in a way that respects their time and the priority that they have for this new code. That's all I have. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Commissioners, any questions for Mr. Durkee? The one question I have, you may have answered, was just, were you aware of kind of the timing, and did the neighborhood or yourself have any feedback on that? It sounds like you answered that you're aware of kind of the timing. That sounds like there's a lot that the neighborhood association can do maybe in the first half, and then in the second half of the year is an opportunity when staff is foreseeing some availability and time to work on it. So sounds like the neighborhood association and yourself are favorable to that type of approach.
We have a committee formed, and I'm one of the leaders of that committee, not the chair, but one of the leaders. And so I think one of our tasks is to think through what are the characteristics of the neighborhood that we're trying to protect. Palisades is a pretty diverse community, and to just have an overlay for the whole community may not make sense, may not be applicable, but it's homes in the 40s, 50s, maybe early 60s that we're concerned with, the kind of the mid-century modern ranch homes that we're trying to protect. And so we want to begin to outline what those characteristics are that we're trying to protect, and then work toward defining a geographical territory in which those characteristics are predominant. So there's that kind of work. I think some grassroots work, letting people in those neighborhoods know what's coming up, what we're doing, get their informal input. So there is work that we can do, I think.
In the first half, right? In the first half, while we're waiting for the staff to be available and look at it in the second half. So that sounds very good, Director Siegel.
And Chair Heap, the other point, I think just strategically, it'll be important to align this work with the policy work that you're doing on House Bill 2001, rather than developing a code that's unique to Palisades and then having this community-wide overlay, or not overlay, but community-wide set of standards come in. I just think that there's greater opportunity to, to sort of achieve the neighborhood's goals once we have that framework defined for the community. Otherwise, we could end up having to redo a lot of it, and no one wants to do that. So that was really another reason for the timing.
Right.
Besides the fact that we just don't have the staff resources to develop a neighborhood overlay in the first 4 months of the year.
Sure, thank you. Commissioner Rigby?
Thank you for speaking. Is there an impetus for making this overlay now? You said you're concerned about preserving the sort of ranch character of a lot of the Palisades neighborhood. Does the community feel like that is in jeopardy, or is this more of a proactive move?
I think the community does feel that it's in jeopardy. There are 5 mid-century homes that have been destroyed within a 1-block radius of my home just in the last 12 months. So we're quickly losing our inventory, and so that's really what's driving it. So far, we've had very strong community support.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. No further questions. Iris, was there anyone else who wished to make comment tonight? All right, so at this time, I'd like to close it for a public comment. We have no others that wish to make public comment. Commissioners, further discussion on our goals. One question I had, Director Siegel, maybe you give some background, is I think it was clear kind of the strategy that we're taking to focus on some of the most pressing work items, such as the middle housing bill. And then, it looks like from the week of May 23rd to August 22nd, it seems like there's a little bit of a hole somewhat in the schedule. I mean, if we look down at the bottom, we can see the Lake Grove Village Center building design and potentially, at that time, the Palisades Neighborhood Association. But any comments on that? Is that indeed a gap, or do we anticipate there'll be, work, in that kind of slot between the week of May 23rd and the week of August 22nd?
Yeah, one thing we know is that there are things that we don't know yet. And that's what this is intended to position us for, is when we have city council goals that will be formalized early next year. We have an economic development strategy or initiative that is a current council goal that'll be defined soon. They're having a study session. Council's having a study session on that on the 21st of this month. And as you can see, the forecast does not incorporate any meeting dates or milestones for that other than an update. So we try to keep some open dates on the calendar, just knowing that there will be work coming to us that we haven't identified yet.
All right, thank you. Next, I'd like to acknowledge that the commissioners received a letter dated today, December 13th, 2021, from the Neighborhood Chairs Committee of Lake Oswego. The Neighborhood Chairs Committee of Lake Oswego was asking us to take another look at the proposal they made for citizen involvement from last year. And I thank the Neighborhood Chairs Committee for bringing this to the Plan Commission. I guess my ask, and I'd ask for staff feedback on this, is I think the real ask that I read from the Neighborhood Chairs Committee is to basically create a new citizen involvement committee. And for that, I would say that's outside the scope of the Plan Commission. On the creation of committees, we'd ask for council feedback on that. If they wanted to change, remove the current citizen involvement committee and create a new one, that would be at the direction of council. And so we'll acknowledge we received this, but I think we'll ask council to give us feedback on the direction to go, if they would like to pursue this or not. Any comments from staff? Does that make sense?
I think that's correct, Chair Heap, and if the commission, if it's the commission's, desire or direction, will include their comments along with the goals that are transmitted to council, so that they have the opportunity to make that decision.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I have just two comments.
Sure.
One, if it goes forward, this is, the Commission for Citizen Involvement is a goal one name, sort of thing. And I would hope we come up with a different name if it's going to have an expanded, I'll just put that out there, expanded role. Two, of course, I think you're correct. What they're saying is that the Planning Commission is basically doing a fine job as far as the goal one citizen committee for citizen involvement. What they're looking for is something more. So that's definitely a council decision.
All right, thank you. So again, we thank them for providing this feedback to the Plan Commission. As staff has said, this will get sent on to council, and so it'll be in the minutes and the record that council can consider, and then we'll look for feedback as the council works through their goals in 2022 to give direction to the Plan Commission for any changes they may want to make regarding the Commission for Citizen Involvement. So the other item on our goals, sorry, I didn't see. Christian, you have a comment?
Yeah, I guess I would like to hear a little bit more discussion regarding Chair Heap, your recommendation for the addition of a goal that you submitted earlier this afternoon.
Oh, sure. Thank you, Vice Chair Pepe. So yes, we'll move on then to the email that I sent this afternoon to the commissioners, and that was asking for the consideration of a goal that involves development code compliancy checks. So I've noticed that several municipalities, maybe not so much so across the state of Oregon, but when you look across the United States, they have similar types of policies in place. And I think it's fairly open to what a development code compliancy check would really mean. In some ways, it could be, somebody, and I think this is the most intensive view of it, but it could be somebody that goes out and checks for development compliancy when there's an occupancy change. And I think it's just a mechanism to look at periodically checking the code and the compliance throughout the city, rather than maybe letting development code compliancy issues go unknown. I do think it's kind of an closed loop process, whereas we create code, we actually see it get used, where in some cases there may be code compliancy issues or code unawareness, and unless somebody says something, that never gets checked, or the issue never gets raised. As I was saying earlier, I don't think the recommendation here is to specify what the strategy would be in terms of how we do code compliancy. Like I was mentioning, and the most intensive end, it would be actually during an occupancy change, having somebody actually do a physical inspection. But it can be a lot less intensive than that. It could be just raising awareness and educating the community that when you're doing a real estate transaction, or if you're doing an occupancy change, you know, you may want to check in, and there's resources where you can go out and check, you know, the state of compliance for that, and see if there's any open issues. So it may be more of an education effort. It could be something in between where, you know, the reports are made available to state what the code compliancy is. So I thought it would be kind of a good way to tie all the hard work that the commission, the staff does in terms of, you know, development code that's created, and try to really see that we have consistency throughout the city, and we raise awareness, and also potentially control maybe some of the frustrations that sometimes come up, you know, where people learn of code compliancy issues, and then they're disappointed, you know, to know that this came up. So, you know, as much notice that we could give may help the process go smoother. So the recommendation here is to really study it and see, you know, maybe what other communities have done, what may work for Lake Oswego, what would be a recommended strategy for implementation. And so I would ask that we put this on our goals list and ask council to consider it. Commissioners, discussion? Commissioner Stewart?
So just so I understand, what you're describing is something akin to code enforcement, but instead of it being for building code, it's for land use planning. Is that the idea?
Yeah, correct. I mean, I think the city could potentially look at, you know, some type of building code inspection when you have real estate transactions, but that would be outside of the scope of what the commission is here. I think I'm really just trying to tie it back to development code, what the commission and all the work between the plan commission, staff, the development review commission, you know, how can we raise awareness of what our development code is, try to get, you know, consistency in the compliancy across it citywide, and then also decrease maybe frustration that arises sometimes when people learn that there is a, you know, compliant issue. You know, situations where somebody could say, you know, I bought this house and I didn't realize that there was a code issue, and then at some later time somebody's you know, wanting to enforce that. They're frustrated. I think sometimes it may go to the DRC then to have them take a look at it and make a decision on, you know, should this apply, you know, how to deal with it. And so this would be more of a proactive measure to address some of those concerns.
Sure, thanks.
Vice Chair Pepe?
I think this would be a good goal for us to have. And with that gap that we've got at the end of Q2 and most of Q3, if there is time available, maybe we could plug it in and have some more discussion as to how to go about tying it in and creating that closed loop that you talked about. And hopefully the one end result could also be an improved citizenry and improve the perception.
Yeah, thank you, Vice Chair Pepe. And I think it's an excellent point. Yeah, we don't want to recommend prioritizing this in the first half. I think, you know, as staff has outlined kind of the priorities with House Bill 2001 and the weather work items that's coming in the first half, we wouldn't change that, but this would be something that we could potentially look at in the second half. Commissioner Rigby?
I think whatever the sort of mechanism of this would be, you've kind of mentioned more of an educational aspect, and then sort of more of a educational but compliance related tack. I think seeing the options available on those I would like to see that. What you say about kind of making people feel that there's even enforcement and a fair treatment between properties, I think that would be a positive thing.
Thank you, Commissioner Rigby. And I would say, I agree. I think the work that would be in the Plan Commission is to study all the options and see what would be the most feasible and agreeable, you know, based on the Plan Commissions and staff's input. Staff, is there any comments that you would like to make based on the discussion you've heard on this?
Well, I'm puzzled because I'm trying to reconcile what I think I'm hearing, which is an inquiry into the city code enforcement operations with the planning commission's role under the city charter and code, which is really to advise the city council on land use policy. And so I'm trying to reconcile those two and be helpful if you could articulate what codes or standards are really, the focus of this, and what is it in the city's current, community development code or land use regulations that you feel are not being enforced or not being enforced equitably?
Yeah, thank you, Director Siegel, for that question and clarification. Yeah, I think maybe it's not so much, in some of the earlier comments we just had here was about enforcement and about equity. And so I think the goal here is not necessarily to have about enforcement, but how can we have more of a consistent code applied, and how can we bring awareness of code as it applies to properties, remove maybe some of the unknowns that people have about the development code and how it may apply. So I think the charter of the commission has been to engage the citizenry, to engage citizen involvement, have them understand better what our code is. And so it would be along those lines to raise awareness. I think if you ask specifically about what code it may involve, it seems like a number of the issues that we've seen have been issues that depend on time and age. And so there could be a situation where there was code in place, and it goes back to somebody that may have did development but not really understood the code, had remained that way for a long period of time until there's a change in occupancy or a change in ownership, and then it's brought to the attention then, and it could have been maybe several changes that had occurred prior to that. So this is an opportunity to allow a check in place to go out and look at is there a resource that the community can use when at least at some point in time when they're doing a property transaction or a change in occupancy, that there's some check that they can say, are there development codes that are applicable, and they may not be totally compliant with. And I think there was a discussion in the past about non-conformance, and I'd like to call that out. I like the word non-conformance a little bit better because it was not so much about enforcement. It was just saying, it could be situations where the code is not, or the site is non-conforming. But I understood the definition of we're using for non-conformance is land uses that at some time were conforming, but at some later time became non-conforming. And so, under that definition of it was sometime conforming and then later became non-conforming, I didn't think that fit very well. So, compliance was, is there a property that has, full compliance, or is there a property that has maybe some development code that's not compliant, and just raising the awareness of that and raising the awareness of what the development code has. The end action that's taken, whether it's enforcement, if it's just raising the education of here's some issues that you might want to be aware of. So it's just educating them rather than enforcing it. But that may be a viable outcome of the work. But we take a look at it. Take a look at what some of the other cities say. And I think it would be a policy decision, to have an activity like this that would fit in the scope of the Plan Commission. I don't see any other commission maybe taking such a policy decision to that other than council. But at council, I think, as we've talked earlier about, we'd want to study what the options are, have feedback from staff, and then among all the commissioners, try to say, this is the recommendation. It may be just more of an education effort. And so that's why I feel like it fits in the scope of the Plan Commission. But I understand some of the points and concerns that are being raised.
Well, I'm still puzzled because I'm trying to understand, you've mentioned a couple of different things that have different meanings in the law. A non-compliance means that something is not in compliance with the code today. Non-conformance means that it was whatever it is, if it was a fence or a land use or something that is happening on the lot, that it was established lawfully under the regulations that were in effect at the time, whether it was yesterday or 10 years ago. And as the codes are amended over time, we do see an increased number of nonconformities. That's a natural. Unfortunately, it's a byproduct of amending the code. Our code's fairly complex, so you do have nonconformities, but those that property with the nonconformity is that right is protected, and they're assured that use or that structure can remain. It's lawful, and there are limits in whether that can be expanded, or generally it has to remain in its conforming state. It's not allowed to expand, so there are limits to that. Non-compliance is something else entirely. That's something that happens without a permit, or it happens contrary to the code, and that's a code enforcement. That's where code enforcement gets involved. Code enforcement doesn't take action against non-conforming properties, and so I think there are different ways that the public or a property owner would become aware of each of these situations. So if you were developing your property, or you were adding on to a house, or doing some sort of home improvement where the development code would apply, and that's generally it's only an exterior improvement. It's something that is extending the structure, or it's using the property, maybe dividing the lot if it's large enough. And that's where the community development code applies, and that's where a non-conforming right that may have existed, may no longer be allowable if the development or the change of use is affecting that in some way. On the other hand, if there's a non-compliance issue on the property and it's discovered through code enforcement, a complaint is lodged and our staff investigate it, that takes a completely different path, and that's a path that's working toward attaining compliance. And that's the primary goal. It's not punitive, it's working towards compliance. Or if the property is subject to a development application, the city cannot approve a development application where there's a known code violation or non-compliance issue. We'll work with the property owner, of course, to try to attain compliance, and through that land use process that can be remedied. But there are a couple of different branches here, and I'm trying to understand what the goal is, perhaps what the problem is that you see in the community that we can help educate people around. I see Vice Chair Pappy's hand is raised, so I don't want to take any more of your time.
Oh, yes, Vice Chair Pappy.
No, I appreciate your comments and your insight there, Director Siegel. And maybe for the discussion purposes, as we're trying to figure out language, maybe we more focus on anomalies that a property might be exposed to right now. And I can see, the positive side of if it's someone coming in and wanting to purchase a home might be able to access this information to try and figure out what might this property be exposed to recently and or in the coming weeks, months, so on and so forth after purchase. On the homeowner's side of it, if it is going to be something along the lines of punitive, we might really need to take a hard look at that and figure out how, if it is a punitive or if they're not, if it is non-conforming. Again, I apologize if I got it mixed up. If it is a non-conforming issue and the homeowner has stepped outside the bounds of what they can do, then there needs to be some type of a balanced approach on how to help the homeowner get back inside the guardrails, if you will.
So I'm going to just jump in here again. I think one thing that you'll want to consider is where we strike a balance between the public interest and the city's responsibility as protecting that public interest and public good, and private due diligence responsibilities between private parties and a buyer and a seller, and there's disclosure laws that apply here as well. So for property owners, aware of a non-compliance issue, then it's in their interest to disclose that, if not remedy it first before they put their house on the market. But that's not something that the city typically intervenes on unless there's a public interest concern. But I don't know if Attorney Boone has anything to add or contribute here, but I would just consider where to strike that balance. And then again, coming back to, what is the Planning Commission's role? Is to advise the council on land use policy matters. And I feel like we're beginning to kind of drift into operations. And certainly it's within the council's purview to direct the city manager to say, if there's operational needs or practices that the council would like the city manager to consider or direct staff to pursue, that would be the appropriate path for that. In terms of an educational program or outreach, we're happy to hear your thoughts, your community members, you hear from your neighbors, and we're always open for, input and suggestions, and a lot of this education, a lot of the education and a lot of the input that we receive is from property owners, residents, business owners, one-on-one. They come into the permit counter, or they have a contractor who's trying to get a project through the process, and lo and behold, there's a fence that is over on the other person's property, or it's too tall, or they discover that the deck was built larger than what the zoning says the lot coverage can be. These are all scenarios, these are very unfortunate. These are routine questions and scenarios that come up. So our staff, whether it's the planning staff or the building plans examiners, or even the city engineer's office, will get involved when there are questions that come up that affect the public right-of-way, fences that are too far into the road, those sorts of things. And we work with people one-on-one to try to find the most customer-friendly, solution-oriented way through these questions. And they can be pretty difficult, but that's what we're here for.
Yeah.
So
thank you, Director Siegel. So a couple of points is one. I think what I was trying to be clear on was the question of conformity and non-conformity. As I had mentioned earlier, maybe I didn't fully understand the definition when I first started looking at this, but then subsequently after discussions, it became clear, what the difference was between compliance and non-conformity. And so the recommendation here was that, we would not take a look at non-conformance. That wouldn't be part of the charter. It would be compliance. And then I think what I'm hearing tonight is a lot of concern specifically about enforcement, and that the enforcement is outside of the kind of scope of what the Plan Commission charter is, and I would say I would agree with that. I think the task here and the suggestion here is to really help, try to put a process in place that puts a closed loop, as I was saying earlier, on our development code, that as codes created, as folks go at some point in time. It may not necessarily be at the point where you're going to transfer property, but it seems like it's a good checkpoint to check in and just say, is there anything that may have been unknown as far as development code compliance goes? And use it as an opportunity to educate. It may not be enforcement. It may not be going to the individuals and saying they have to become compliant and it's an enforcement. But I think it's a great opportunity to identify at those points in time, are there any non-compliant issues that they should be made aware of? And then it may be their decision on, like you were saying earlier, it could be their decision to follow through with the transaction, not to ask before the transaction completes that the compliancy issues be addressed, but that's all up to them. So I really see this as kind of more of an education type of opportunity, and hopefully it would help kind of lessen some of the frustration people may have with not knowing if there's development code compliancy issues. And then also, maybe kind of with this process in place, having more consistency in our development code, as it's applied throughout the city. So I see two questions. Vice Chair Pape, I see you have a question, and Director Siegel, I think you would, or excuse me, Attorney Boone, you would like to make a comment too. So let me take the comment from Attorney Boone, and then I'll come to Vice Chair Pape.
Well, you keep focusing on the transfer, the time of transfer to be a good time to do an audit. That's an education tool. The city has no code, and I don't think we could, nor is there a statute which requires somebody to check in with the city to audit the status of their property. And obviously, people have different timelines on their transfers, so that would be an administrative problem getting involved in that. So I think that's, again, an educational tool to suggest people look at their own property. And I can just tell you, I only see the ones that have problems, but I can tell you that people don't read their deeds. I mean, that's a good time that's an audit, okay, but sometimes they don't even do that. Or their covenants, or restrictive provisions we put on there. So you're not gonna get 100%, obviously, and I'm not sure, you're not expecting that. If you wanna suggest to people that there's appropriate time to take a look around before they put the property up for sale to do an audit, well, all that really is they need to read the code and what did they do on their property, and do they have the right permits?
Yeah, in an audit, I mean, I would think of it as a home inspector. I mean, that's why you hire a home inspector, and of course, they're not always going to get 100% of the issues, but they should be, looking for that. They have checklists, and they're looking at accessory structures. I know that that's something that they look at. And then, of course, we get, brokers, and we get prospective buyers and tenants who come to the city, or they call our staff, every day with questions about property. They want to know if there are existing code violations that are of record. Those are all matters that we can be helpful with.
At a property transfer, you have two parties who have an interest in making sure things are good. Okay.
Yeah.
Seller and the buyer. They both have an interest in it.
Thank you. Vice Chair Pepe.
Having gone through something very, very similar to what Chair Heap is explaining, when we purchased our home, as a buyer, it would have been very, very helpful if there was one point of access to where you could get, even if it was 80% accurate, would have been very helpful. Again, I can also see it from the homeowner's side that if there was an audit, if the city all of a sudden says, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do audits of randomly chosen properties, that could be maybe a point of contention. That said, maybe, and as I'm saying this, I don't know if it actually would fit in to this bucket, but could this be a goal that we put in the Commission for Citizen Involvement bucket? And we reach out to neighborhood associations and find out if them through their networks, if this is something that might be of interest to them, and for them as well, helping formalize and manage their associations.
Thank you, Vice Chair Pepe. Commissioner Buchanan.
Thank you. As you guys may or may not know, I'm a real estate agent, and I can tell you, you can drag a horse to water, and sometimes you cannot get that water to drink. And so, you might have a little old man who's selling a property, and he knows nothing of his property. And then you have somebody else buying the property, and you try and get them to study it, and they will not do it. And there's only so much you can do to get them to this point. And so I think the point of having, one point of access is great, but trying to audit is definitely going to open us up to liabilities that I don't think, we have any control of.
well, just as the attorney, I'm not sure what openness to liability is. I'm going to reserve that issue. But just as, you know, if we were 80% accurate, well, I could tell you we're going to hear about the other 20, you know?
Yeah.
You know, so, again, I think the question is what, as Director Siegel indicated, the question is policy and code for this commission. So if you're going to, is there a policy we need to look at, or are there code languages we need to look at? I think probably not. We have the code language. The problem is they're not complying with the code. Is there educational aspect to it? You need to define the scope of what you're really trying to do here. And obviously it would have to be in coordination with city management, because these are resource questions, financial resource questions, personnel.
Yeah, thank you, Attorney Boone and Commissioner Buchanan and Vice Chair Pepe. I would say that, again, we're coming back too much to the enforcement and to like audits. I would say, I like Vice Chair Pepe's comment about, you know, working with the neighborhood associations and maybe getting input from them. And I liked your comment too, Commissioner Buchanan, that, you know, you can lead a horse to water, but it may not drink. I mean, yeah, I think that is the goal, is to look at education, not so much the enforcement, not so much the audit, but, you know, from citizen involvement perspective, you know, how can we increase the education, the information? So it may better fit from an education and from a citizen involvement perspective, I guess, in the citizen involvement goals.
So again, the Commission for Citizen Involvement is charged with public engagement toward implementing statewide planning goals, which are our comprehensive plan. So the Citizen Involvement Commission is the public engagement branch or advisory board to the City Council on land use planning under statewide planning goals. So I think you still end up having to ask yourselves this question: what are the land use policies that, you know, we're needing to provide greater education and outreach to the public on? And then what, you know, what does that feedback loop look like from the neighborhood associations or the public? For example, you know, if you were to hear, yeah, we think there should be more information, more proactive information from the city when the city amends the development code to inform the public of the changes in land use regulation that are occurring. And that's feedback that, you know, obviously we would take to heart, and that's clearly within the scope of the Planning Commission and the Planning Department. And, you know, that's policy that we could implement through our public involvement program. And that's something that we continuously, you know, work toward improving. So when we do public engagement around land use code changes, you know, on the other hand, if you hear back, you know, we think the city should inspect every property annually. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but, you know, inspect every residential property annually and file an audit that can be accessed by realtors, by, you know, people who are buying or selling real estate. And then I would say that that's an operations and a resource matter, and it's what you're hearing is people asking for, you know, an elevated level of resources or activity around enforcing existing code and policy. And I'd say that's not within the Planning Commission's purview. And that feedback loop would perhaps go to the city manager or the council, but it wouldn't be something that we wouldn't recommend the Planning Commission spend time on it.
Thank you, Director Siegel, but in all due respect, it's like the third or fourth time that I have at least mentioned that it's not about enforcement, but yet we come back there and we talk about, you know, if we're going this direction, we're going to recommend that there would be an audit performed. I don't think it's that case. I think it's, again, an opportunity to provide information to citizens about our development code. It could be a simple, you know, policy to stay in place if, you know, if citizens would have questions on compliancy, there may be resources that they can go to, you know, reports that they could get, not an audit or an inspection that somebody would come out, but there's easy things that I think could potentially be done to, you know, share the development code, educate the community, and then have an opportunity for people to at least look at their property and say, you know, is there a report or anything that I can see details about my property? It's not necessarily to do an audit or anything like that, or have an inspection into, go after enforcement. Vice Chair Pepe?
A little off topic, and I apologize, but not too far. Director Siegel, maybe I need to refresh my Commission for Citizen Involvement documents, but you made a comment that the Commission for Citizen Involvement is only to hear questions, concerns regarding state land use planning goals. And anything outside of that, we're not supposed to entertain?
Commissioner Pape, if that was unclear, I apologize. The Commission for Citizen Involvement was actually created under the auspices of the statewide planning goals. Every city and county in the state of Oregon must have one. In many communities, the Planning Commission and the Commission for Citizen Involvement are one and the same as they are here. The Commission's purpose is really the same today as it was then. In the city code, it explains that the Commission is to advise the council on land use planning matters. And I'm paraphrasing, but that's what it is under our comprehensive plan, which is the plan that implements the statewide planning goals, among other things. So that's where it comes from. I mean, today the commissions in all of the jurisdictions around the state, they've accomplished that mission. They've implemented the statewide planning program, and now we're maintaining our comprehensive plans under that statewide planning program, and that's what the commission. That's the commission's function, is to provide public involvement toward maintaining our comprehensive plan.
Okay,
and development code.
Okay. So we need to keep it to that.
Yeah, so that's why I think that, the chair earlier, in acknowledging the comments that he received from the Neighborhood Chairs Committee, said, because the Chairs Committee was asking for a different scope for the commission, that would be a decision that the council would need to make, and it's not something the Planning Commission would opine on, because the Chairs Committee was asking for the Public Involvement Commission to have purview over other city programs and operations, including, I think, parks and public works, and advising on public involvement around many other functions of the city. So that's what I mean when I say the CCI is really focused, or ought to be focused, on land use under the current code.
All right, thank you, Director Siegel, Vice Chair Pepe. I guess at this time, I'd like to make a motion to include the goal of looking at how we can educate the community with regards to code compliancy and help. So there's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
There's a second by Vice Chair Pape. Discussion on the motion, Commissioner Stewart.
Yeah, I just, before we vote, I want, whoops. There it is. Before we vote, I just wanted to ask one other question real quick on item number 3. The one that states information on smart cities and relevance to land use planning. What sorts of topics are you planning on looking at for that item, like relative to smart cities? Is there anything specific?
Commissioner Stewart, if I may, there was a motion on the specific to add the one goal, and if we can, we'll come back to that.
Okay,
So we're not making a motion on
voting on,
not on
voting
everything.
on
So I just wanted to get a feedback from the commission for adding a goal for the development code compliancy education. Commissioner Rigby?
Thank you. I think I like the discussion we've been having. What I think I've been hearing is, though this is something important and something I personally am in favor of looking at the options with, talking about bringing a horse to water. I think in this case, maybe sometimes it's like, if you bring a horse to muddy water, well, maybe he's not going to drink it until you filtered it. So if you just hand someone the code and say, well, here's the code, look at it or don't, that's up to you. It makes me think of the GIS program where, you can look up your property and then, there hasn't been an audit done on your property. Someone hasn't come and, put in information regarding your property onto the entry in the GIS program, but it has information regarding, this is the zoning of it and it's within, this city jurisdiction or whatever. Maybe maybe what is being suggested is something along the lines of having more specific information regarding what purview or what rule areas a property falls under instead of having to hunt through the code. But it sounds like these kinds of recommendations for city programs are maybe outside of the purview of the commissions on which we sit. Does staff see an avenue where that kind of programming would fit under our purview?
I think no, I don't really, to be honest with you. I think the way you would see for example, a more robust GIS program developed by the city that would include intelligence on individual properties, that would be a strategic goal perhaps of the city council that was wanting to improve customer service in some way and would say, we need a higher level of data on our GIS system for real estate transactions, and we're going to do everything that we can within our resources to provide that data. And that's where I would see that coming from. To be honest with you, I think it would come from a desire to improve data and customer service rather than from a land use planning policy or initiative. And so I'm trying to be helpful here, but I feel like I'm not, and that's kind of the frustration. Maybe it would be helpful for the other commissioners to hear more, Chair Heap, about what are some of the specific types of code compliancy issues that you're seeing or that you're hearing about in the community that we could then, in turn, we could look at the development code, say maybe there's a better way to approach the policy objective that we're trying to get at with this code, and then that would be a way that the Planning Commission could engage on a level that I think is within your purview, looking at the standards, looking at the land use purpose of the code, rather than looking at, I guess, operations or data science. And I don't know, I'm just trying to think of a way through this for you.
Sure, and thank you, Dr. Siegel. And I think it's about education and trying to have the community be more informed about the code. And so specifically it would be, I think some of the major compliance issues you had mentioned are true. If you see like a home inspector go out, sometimes they'll look for, setback violations in terms of the, building structure and things like that. Not always. I think as I've talked to some appraisers, they're like, I ask them, I said, are you really looking at that? Are you measuring? Are you concerned about that? And he goes, nah, not really. I'm not really looking too closely at any of that development code stuff. I'm looking at, the overall house. Does it square footage? How many bedrooms does it have? That type of stuff. And so, it would be mostly related to some of the, maybe you could call them lesser degree type of codes, which are, the accessory structures, as we were mentioning, setbacks for those could potentially be, things like fences. So it's the lower order of degree of, code, development code. And I think that's a good check. I mean, if the community gets awareness of these type of, issues that exist, there's two things that can come. This is why I think it makes sense. Is because one, we're all spending a lot of time here late at night. We're trying to develop code, staff's involved from the resource perspective, but if we're creating code that nobody knows about and kind of goes unchecked, then it's a waste of time. And so, if you get that feedback coming back from the community to say, oh, why do we have this code? Maybe it's then code that we can clean up. And the Plan Commission to say, hey, we've received feedback, there's raised awareness that, these compliancy issues may exist now, but maybe the community feels like these aren't really code, the way we have this code structured, it's really not worthwhile to have in there. So we take it out. We say it's not something that we as a community, rather than just leaving it exist there, but kind of going unnoticed. So I think it's a huge opportunity for us here to, again, take a look at the code, have it be more of a closed loop mechanism, receive that feedback from the community. It may not be enforcement, it may be, then we have more citizen involvement coming back to us to say, change the code. It's like, we're now aware that there may be some compliance issues here, but we think these are silly, to remove that type of code, shouldn't comply. I think that'll be very useful. And there may be others who get very frustrated to say, hey, if we have code, why are people not aware of it? Why are people not following it? And so it tries to clean that up so that, if the community feels like that code is really not code that belongs in place, that we get that feedback to take a look, maybe we should remove it. And then it addresses maybe some of the concerns that the community has, where they ask, why did that code kind of go unnoticed? And then why is it becoming, or why aren't we following it? And it creates kind of frustration from it becoming a big issue. So we had a motion. I was looking for the feedback. We had discussion on the motion. Vice Chair Pepe, more discussion on the motion?
Yeah, and I hope this falls in line with discussion on the motion. Director Siegel, if we identify a goal tonight and we vote to approve it and put it on the goal sheet, at some point between now and December 31st, 2022, if we decide to remove that goal, that's an okay decision to make, correct?
Yeah, Commissioner Pape, the goals are a way for us to prioritize our work, for you to prioritize your work, and for staff to allocate resources to these projects and initiatives. So, it would be helpful to know the relative importance of this, against everything else that you're working on. But,
right.
the way that I think with any project we would want to go, we need better, definition of what is the problem that we're trying to address, and we would go through a scoping, process in a study session, or a work session with the commission. We would bring information. I would want our senior code enforcement staff to be here to answer your questions about what code enforcement education and outreach currently looks like, and then we would go from there. So it may be that you would explore, maybe the goal is explore the need or opportunities for public education and communications around, code compliance or something. We could have a work session on that, and you could decide if there's a land use policy component to it that you'd want to pursue.
And being that we're pretty well focused in for the first 6 months of 2022 on House Bill 2001, maybe that's an opportunity to kind of flush this out a little bit, put in some tentative date on what you just suggested, and then we can figure out whether or not we want to take it from a lowercase, a lowercase GS to an uppercase GS in the in our annual meeting.
Yeah, and we would look for a work session date sometime around. It may be able to drop in one of these dates if there is another work that takes priority from the council or otherwise, or alternatively, we would look for some time later in the year. That's your direction, of course.
All right, thank you. There's no other discussion on the motion, then I'll call for a vote. Iris, would you call the roll? And again, maybe a point of clarification, sorry, Iris, this is only to consider, can we make a recommendation to add a goal to explore the education options related to code compliancy? It's the only thing that we're voting on here. Yeah, Iris, please call the roll.
Buchanan,
Nay.
Heap,
Yes?
Pepe,
Yes.
Rigby,
Yes.
Stewart,
Yes.
Thank you. The motion passes. So we ask staff to add that goal, and happy to work. I think all the discussion that was given about the prioritization, we don't want to prioritize this as a high priority in the first half. We could schedule it in at the second half. And I think some of the later statements on exploring what our options are and looking at it from that perspective is a correct direction that we'd be asking for as a goal. All right. Commissioners, any other discussion on the goals? Or should we make a motion to approve the goals with the added goal that we just voted on?
Chair Egan, I believe Commissioner Stewart had a comment or a question earlier about.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Thank you. Sorry, Commissioner
No,
Stewart. I
no
didn't mean.
problem.
So ask a question now.
Yeah, sorry, I had misunderstood. I thought you were calling for a vote on everything, including that goal. Okay, so question on smart cities and relevance to land use planning. I was just curious if at this time you had any sort of specific topics relative to smart cities in Lake Oswego that you were planning on exploring.
Commissioner Stewart, no, I do not. I think the commission had asked for some information, some background on what smart cities initiatives look like or what they could look like. And it's really all over the board in terms of, what smart cities means. It's, shorthand or, another way of describing it is the Internet of Things. So it's every device, it's every means of communication that's out there with radio frequency that can either help inform decisions or drive decisions around design or even land use master planning on a fairly large scale in places like Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, have done city planning based on smart cities principles where transportation, utilities, even land use decision making is informed by data that's collected.
Okay, so this could possibly take the form of a presentation by an expert or something
It
like
would
that.
it would be
Okay, all right.
it could be a shallow swim or a deep dive into the topic. And I mean, just by way of actually on the ground examples in Lake Oswego. So most recently, I think, we made the shift toward, or perhaps we're still in the transition toward a remote meter reading, capabilities on water. That's a smart city application.
Mm-hmm.
It's driving toward efficiency and real-time information about water use, also helping detect leaks, in the system. That's a kind of a small example of smart cities. I think if we were to look at this at the Planning Commission, it might be helpful to look at it once, when we have a sub-area plan that we're exploring, whether it's, something like, the Foothills District at some point off in the future, or, another large area plan that we're exploring. It might be a good, some good context.
Okay, that's great,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Stewart. Just to add to that, I think I brought up the discussion as we were looking at goal number 4, which was the Oregon's climate-friendly, equitable communities rules. As it started talking about looking at climate-friendly areas, transportation systems, plans, updates, and things like that, I thought it may be an opportunity to say, hey, is there possible aspects of smart communities that, we could fit in to that work? But I think I agree with everything that Director Siegel had said. I think it's maybe an opportunity for us again to learn and raise the awareness of it, and then the Plan Commission can evaluate, is there some aspect of that we could incorporate in an appropriate time.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jerry. So like parking management, pricing parking spaces, and not that we're doing that or exploring it, but that's an area where smart cities technology is really helpful, knowing what parking utilization looks like across the city or in public spaces. Obviously, there's resources required to do that, but, it's a blue sky sort of inquiry.
Any other questions commissioners have about the overall goals? None? We have a motion then to approve the set of recommended goals with the addition of the goal that we just previously discussed on related to compliancy exploration.
So moved.
So move, is there a second?
Second.
There's a second. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None. Any abstains? None. That's approved. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, staff and commissioners. We'll move on then to our next agenda item. This is agenda item 7.2, House Bill 2001. This is a work session number 1. Public comments are accepted. Commission will consider a first set of concepts to amend the Community Development Code in order to comply with House Bill 2001 and provide direction to staff on drafting code language. The first set of concepts focuses on requirements of House Bill 2001 that afford limited or no discretion to the city and how it complies with the bill. The staff coordinator is Erik Olson, senior planner. Erik, would you like to lead us into the discussion?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair Heap. I have a couple quick slides for you today, so I'll just wait for Iris to get those up. All right, so I haven't actually been here at the Planning Commission in quite a while. I think the last time was back in June. So I realize that there are some new commissioners here that might be a little bit less familiar with what we've been doing for the last couple of years. So I'll keep that in mind as I move through this presentation. This really, there's a lot of work that went into where we're at now. So, I'm going to do my best to present to the wide variety of different experiences, I think, here. All right, so just to check in on our current work plan, of course, this is kind of starting in May of this year for phase 2, as we've been calling it. Everything was initiated actually about a year ago now. At the end of 2020, we started doing a lot of research and development and a lot of public engagement to determine sort of what we can and cannot do within the realm of the requirements passed by the state for House Bill 2001, as well as doing a lot of research and reconnaissance on neighborhood character and characteristics in particular that residents value the most. Kind of came up with a set of recommendations which were housed in what we call the Middle Housing Opportunities Report at that point, so about in May. So with that set of recommendations in mind, we sort of started with the work that you can see here, so scoping and chartering, and then kind of presenting those recommendations a few times to the Planning Commission and City Council. We then, with direction from City Council, appointed, and we convened 6 meetings. It says 5 there, but it was actually 6 of the Middle Housing Code Advisory Committee. Results from that work, the recommendations from the Middle Housing Code Advisory Committee, which were really, they were charged by council to develop a set of recommendations to comply, code concepts to comply with House Bill 2001 while still maintaining the sense of place, neighborhood character, and livability within the city. So the output of that was then presented last month to a joint meeting of the City Council and Planning Commission on the 16th. Also, we're presenting a lot of the recommendations there at a community forum, which is currently, or actually happened last week, but we currently have a story map and survey live on our website that have similar information. So folks can kind of get a similar download of the information and provide input through the survey there. So that's currently active and will be active through the rest of the year. Right now, though, we're jumping into the code development phase. So this is the first of 4 work sessions that we're planning with the Planning Commission. to sort of help develop and refine the code concepts that we got out of the advisory committee over the summer into adoption-ready code. And so that would ideally lead to hearings in the spring of 2022, which we will need to adopt compliant code by the state's deadline of June 30th, 2022. So in terms of the Planning Commission work sessions, I just want to go over kind of the rough topics that we'll be going over there, at least in our proposed work plan. So today, again, we're going to focus on just the prescribed amendments that unfortunately we understand the city does not have much flexibility to control. On the 10th, though, we'll start to talk a little bit more broadly about some of the siting and design standards that the city does have the ability to control. So we'll have that conversation sort of focused around duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and townhomes. And on that date, really, it seems like a lot, but the regulations for duplexes are similar, as would be for triplexes, quadplexes, and townhouses. So hopefully, once you understand, the sort of broad parameters, it will easily apply to the other middle housing types. On the 24th, we'll then talk a little bit more about cottage clusters, including some of the remaining policy questions related to cottage clusters, things like the minimum lot size for a cottage cluster and other types of housing will be a pretty big policy question that we'll be visiting then. But other sort of characteristics of cottage clusters, such as the number of dwellings and the unit size, are things that we'll talk about then and need some guidance on. And then by the 14th of February, we'll then present the code amendments as translated into code language, just to make sure that we're properly translating the guidance into the code language itself from our previous work sessions. And just to touch base again on the sort of community outreach and public engagement that we've been doing, we had 6 meetings of the Middle Housing Code Advisory Committee, as I stated before, over the summer, between July and October. And those were all open to the public, and we did our best to really discuss and have all the public comments available. And there was a pretty diverse set of interests that were involved there too, including representatives from the Neighborhood Chairs Committee as well. As I mentioned, just last week, we held Community Forum number 1, talking a little bit about the advisory committee findings and recommendations. And we have another community forum that we're hoping to hold in February of next year, again, where we'll take those draft code amendments after they've been developed a bit further and talk about them in more detail. We've also offered presentations to neighborhood associations on House Bill 2001 and middle housing, as well as a whole slew of different media and social media updates that we've been working on with our communications team. All right, so I guess I can talk a little bit. I don't know if there's any questions about this proposed work plan before we get into the sort of initial set of prescribed code amendments, but I'll just go ahead and field questions if there's any on the work plan.
Sure. Thank you. Commissioners, any questions for Senior Planner Olson? No? No questions?
All right, so I guess for the next few portions of the presentation, feel free to sort of interrupt and ask questions along the way, because we're going to cover a lot of material in a fairly high level, but I'll try to be as clear as possible. So really what we're talking about again right now are the first set of code packages that the city will need to pursue that we really don't have many remaining policy questions related to right now. So the first set of code amendments are sort of grouped under definitions. And so these are the things that we'll need to accomplish within the code. One thing is to really distinguish between the sort of multifamily housing definitions that we currently have in the code and middle housing as required under Division 46 by the state. Just as a reminder, that includes very specific types of middle housing, such as duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters. So really those 5 housing types is what it's referring to. So we'll need to make definitions that sort of distinguish between middle housing and multifamily housing. We'll also need to add a definition of cottage cluster in there because there's no current definition in our code. Really nothing in Lake Oswego, I'm sure, that we have right now could be classified as like an existing cottage cluster, so this is a fairly new concept. But the state will sort of force us to include a rough version of this definition, that it's a grouping of no fewer than 4 detached dwelling units per acre with a footprint of less than 900 square feet each. That includes a common courtyard. So that's one of the things we'll have to do for cottage cluster. And so you see that they do reference this word courtyard in there. And the courtyard that they're referring to for cottage clusters is a bit different perhaps than the courtyards that we refer to for some of our commercial design standards and things like that. So we might just need to revise or add some language to our current definition of courtyard to ensure that it sort of jives with the definition of cottage cluster and the way that courtyard is used there. And the last thing that we would need to do is add a definition for a townhouse project to align with Division 46. So this is looking a little bit differently at townhouses as a larger project and not just units on individual lots. So for those that are familiar with townhomes, one sort of defining characteristic is that they're defined by being one unit on their own lot. So this would look at sort of the parent lot, if you will, and look at the sort of project, including all the other attached units as a whole, as opposed to just sort of a single slice, just a single unit on a single lot. It'll look at the entire development. So this is fairly broad, but it's one of the sort of major moves of the legislation is that all these middle housing types will need to be allowed in existing zones that allow for detached single-family use. So I've listed those out here. You can see that it's nearly all of the residential zones in the city that will need to be modified in this way such that middle housing would apply. Another few things that we'll have to take a look at is we do have direction from the state that when it comes to the purposes of sensitive lands, typically there's an allowance for an encumbered site to have at least a single family unit be constructed on that site. And we understand from the state that we'll have to allow duplexes to also have that same ability. So essentially the easiest way to explain this is that everything that we would currently allow for single family needs to also be allowed for duplexes. So it's a little bit more straightforward with duplexes. There's a lot more nuance with other middle housing types though.
What are the distinctions that are made there? What is the allowance when you bump up to a triplex or quadplex or et cetera?
So there are some policy questions that we'll, as I mentioned in the slide, I guess, consider later, but essentially there's a requirement that you can rebuild a duplex on an encumbered lot. But there are no requirements that you could build triplexes or any sort of higher forms of middle housing with more than 2 units. So that would be a policy question for the city as to whether or not we would want to allow that.
Commissioner Stewart, you have a question?
Just to remind me, where did Lake Oswego or the state land on the definition of duplexes? Are those allowed to be detached or are they only attached?
That is a very good question. So this is something we've talked about at the advisory committee at length. The state does allow for duplexes to be defined as detached units. And we did have some recommendations actually from the advisory committee to explore that. But we did hear from city council that they really didn't want to do that by this June 30th, 2022 deadline, that would be adding a little bit more complexity than they thought was necessary, and that they didn't necessarily support the idea of detached plexes. So we do have direction from council to pursue a traditional attached definition of a duplex.
Okay, because my next question was going to be, do you foresee any conflicts between the standards for duplexes and the standards for cottage clusters? Because the way the definition of a cottage cluster is written, it says a minimum of 4 units per acre, but conceivably you could have 2 units on half an acre and still be a cottage cluster, correct?
You'd have to meet that minimum density for a cottage cluster.
But it would meet the minimum density because on half an acre you can have 2 units, right?
Well, again, you wouldn't. Well, if we go back to the definition, it could be no fewer than 4 detached dwelling units per acre. So that is that minimum, but you could have more theoretically.
I guess, but typically, if you think of it as a much larger development, and on high density residential zones, there's standards that say something like you can have 20 housing units per acre, but a lot of times if you develop a 10-acre site, then you can have up to 10 units. You see what I'm saying?
So we'll talk a little bit more about density
And
later.
this may be a question down the road when we actually talk about cottage clusters, but the way this definition is written, I think there's a conflict there.
So duplexes are not included as cottage cluster units. It's a separate type of middle housing.
Correct.
So
yes.
the cottage clusters are a form of detached middle housing that are not duplexes or triplexes or quadplexes, but they are, under the definition, they're detached units.
Well, if city council pursues duplexes as only being attached, then there's no discussion. All I'm saying is if we ultimately decide that duplexes can be detached, I still think there's an issue here, but we can discuss it another time.
There were two next to each other, say.
Right, but what they've been duplexes for forever have been attached. I mean, the definition of a duplex is attached units. The state has been talking about potentially interpreting the duplexes to also be detached, which is a whole different thing.
Yeah,
So
I
that's
think
why I raised the question.
we do have direction from city council to not go that direction. At least.
Right,
So,
right.
hopefully we don't have to get into those weeds.
Okay, thanks.
So I will pick back up just to, go over the rest of the applicability slide here. I think I just mentioned that we would have to regulate essentially for sensitive lands purposes, duplexes the same way that we would currently regulate single-family dwellings. So we will be touching on some policy questions at a later work session related to specifically what to do in certain situations for higher middle housing types that aren't duplexes. In terms of the other thing, we will need to amend certain provisions for what are called master planned communities in the Division 46 state rules. We call them planned unit developments or planned developments here in Lake Oswego for the most part. But essentially, what we'll need to do within master planned communities is allow them to increase their density to at least 8 dwelling units per acre if they apply to do this, and also allow for the development of a duplex on every lot, again, through sort of a modification to that PUD. So that would, again, touch on that sort of core foundational concept of treating duplexes essentially the same way that we would currently treat single family in the code. But it's a little bit looser for, the overall plan unit development and the design. Could include some single-family housing, but it would have to sort of balance it out in a way that accomplished at least 8 dwelling units per acre. And that's really just so that they can plan for infrastructure and make sure that they can provide as much as they need to in those areas. So, I think that it's probably limited applicability where this would apply, but just to be clear.
Well, sorry, one question going back to the other one.
Yeah.
In the comments, it calls out that what really catches my attention is calling out previously approved plan unit developments, and it just seems like that, like you said, the applicability to that's not going to be very great because how many previously approved PUDs don't have things like the homeowners associations and CCNRs with restrictions and things like that. So I think this seems like it's more of a again a prescriptive state compliance requirement that we got to put in, but as far as the applicability goes to Lake Oswego, it doesn't seem like it's going to come into play too much. I think people may get concerned when they say, hey, we're changing something, this was previously approved PUDs, must go back and now allow, 8 dwelling units per acre. I just don't see that happening too extensively throughout Lake Oswego for previously approved plan unit developments.
I think that's a reasonable, I think for the most part, as you mentioned, there's a overlap in the areas where there's master plan communities and where some restrictive covenants might exist. But, I think really what drove a lot of this very specific languages in the code is that Wilsonville was developing their Villebois development at the same time that they're kind of putting this together. And there's a lot of questions that sort of they had that were active that got raised during that process. So, there's other cities that are doing a lot more current planning for PUDs, I think.
And the PUDs that they're talking about here, it's, again, these are PUDs that could be single-family home PUDs, right? It's not like town, they're talking about 8 dwellings per acre for a single-family PUD, which seems like it would maybe cause alarm in our community, but when you look at the real applicability that it's going to, the effect it's going to have in our community, it seems to be very low.
Well, 8 units per acre could be, you know, a 4,000 to 5,000 square foot lot, and we do have R5 zoning, which covers much of Oak Creek and I think some of Westlake area. So, I mean, you're right. I mean, it's sort of a moot point for a lot of these areas that are developed and have pre-existing restrictions on them.
Thank you, Director Siegel.
Yeah, I just, want to remind everybody that at this point, you can now, under HB 2001, you can build up to 4 times the density on a given lot as well. So really, 8 dwellings per acre is maybe not as dense as some other housing types and development that we might see, just to be, not to scare folks, but just put it in perspective, I guess.
Thank you.
So just kind of an extension of the applicability conversation, just looking at just specifically where we allow uses and which zones. So it's, just kind of a different way of saying what I said before, that we're going to have to allow all the different types of middle housing in the zones that currently allow single family. So this is a table that just shows where we currently are in compliance and where we're going to need to make changes. So just kind of moving forward into review procedures, again, going back to that same base concept that, duplexes very specifically have to be treated just like the same as single family, but when it comes to middle housing, there's a general concept too. And when it comes to the review procedures, there's something that we're gonna need to change so that the review procedure for middle housing would be the same as the review procedure for single family dwellings. So currently, there are some, there are a lot of decisions, I guess, that are classified as minor decisions. So any multifamily construction would be classified as a minor decision currently under our code, and that requires additional review and additional sort of process. So we would need to subject all middle housing to a different process than we would for multifamily of, higher than middle housing construction. And so we would recommend making middle housing subject to minor decision review procedure, essentially, so that it's treated the same way as middle housing. I'm sorry, ministerial. I said that incorrectly. It's currently a minor decision. And back to density, I think this might touch a little bit on what Commissioner Stewart's questions were. But, one thing I would just point out is that we really aren't able to apply maximum density at all anymore based on the state requirements. We can't apply it to townhomes because they're sort of a different beast in terms of how they're all sort of individual units on each of their own lots. So it's a lot more, it makes sense to talk about density there just in the way that it's regulated. But when it comes to the current maximum density provisions that we have in a lot of the zones that you see on the screen, R15, R10, R75, R5, RDD, RW, and R3, we're going to have to eliminate the maximum density provisions. So I guess we would actually grant an exception to them for middle housing in those districts. And so the one thing I would point out though is that density is one way, this sort of, units per acre metric is one way to control density, but the way that the state allows us to control density is through minimum lot area. So, currently it's generally, you'd have an R5 district, 5,000 square foot minimum lot size for, a single family or, other types of development that's allowed in the R5, but you could have a single family and a detached ADU on most lots currently. And so minimum lot area would then, still apply, but you'd be able to have more units constructed on a given lot that meets the minimum lot size. And so I will just point out there, though, that there are some policy questions that we'll want to talk about in terms of, do we want to allow higher middle housing, such as triplexes, quadplexes, and cottage clusters on the same lots where we would allow single family? There is some discretion to limit that lot size, and that's something that we'll talk about at our next study session in a lot more detail. And I will just, while we're on density, point out that we will also have to establish, as we pointed out with the definition, that there would be a minimum of 4 units per acre minimum density for cottage clusters. So we'd have to set that minimum for cottage clusters. We can still keep the maximum density for townhouses, but otherwise we'd have to remove the maximum densities for the other middle housing types. And this is perhaps the most controversial, but it's very straightforward in many ways. Essentially, we need to amend our parking code to require 1 space per unit for all middle housing. Currently, we require slightly more for some multifamily developments. As you can see here, if it's a 1-bedroom unit, we would require 1.25 parking spaces, or 1.5 spaces if it's 2 or more bedrooms in a multifamily apartment development. So it is somewhat a reduction compared to multifamily, what we currently require now, but it is consistent, at least with what we require for single-family housing, as well as what we currently require for things like duplexes. And lastly, I'll just talk about conversions to middle housing or additions. So currently, essentially when building is going through a conversion or an addition, we offer an exception from requiring public improvement. Well, actually, I'm sorry, this is a different, I'm going on a tangent here, I'll back up. So currently, we cannot apply design standards to conversions or additions, or basically based on the state guidance, we cannot apply design standards to conversions or additions that create middle housing. And we do have building design standards where we would currently do this. Sorry, I'm being a bit confusing, but we need to essentially amend our building design standards and a couple of the standards related to conversions and additions in the Lake Grove Village Center and Glen Marie R15 overlays. So that just will need to sort of confirm, or I'm sorry, we'll need to clarify rather within the code that we cannot sort of apply those design standards when it's conversion or addition. When it comes to public improvements, we'd also have to institute something where we treat duplexes similarly to single-family housing. So we do currently offer an exception from requiring or deferring public improvements for single-family dwellings, but we wouldn't offer this for other housing types currently.
So Eric, I'm sorry, just to clarify, it's not that the city makes an exception for single family, so we don't have the authority to exact or require the improvements for single family dwellings under Dolan, under case law.
Right.
Because the impact of a single family home on the system doesn't reach a level where, and it's not regulated as minor development, first of all. And if it were, then it would be evaluated under that Dolan test. Does this dwelling or does this middle housing have an impact that necessitates public improvements, widening a street, for example? And we don't currently subject single-family homes to minor development because, among other reasons, state law requires a clear and objective or ministerial process for housing, and single-family homes are ministerial.
Yeah, I think the conditioning authority is probably a better way to phrase this. So we currently do not have the conditioning authority to require or defer public improvements for single-family. And from what we understand from the state, we could not do that for duplexes either.
For clarity, is that for existing single-family homes or new homes as well?
For existing, we don't, for existing existing single-family homes, we don't impose any exaction because it's a ministerial building permit. If you have greater than that, okay, that is, if you're gonna have a triplex, quadplex, et cetera, we do pick that up. Reason being, the way I think of the reason being is when the lot was created, the proposed use was single-family residential. That's the time the exaction would occur. So if you're going to go above that intensity, then that's where we picked it up.
Thank you.
Yeah, apologies if this isn't clear, but essentially, yeah, this does apply to existing single-family housing currently. So we're talking about conversions and additions, essentially, of So, I think a lot of what this question is really about is, the city, and I think we have direction basically to do this, but we can still apply that conditioning authority when it comes to this higher middle housing types, the triplex, quadplex, townhouses, and cottage clusters. And I think in a lot of ways, we'll kind of have to do that if we want to make sure that we get the public improvements that we really think would be needed along with this higher density. So there's a few questions that we have for DLCD that we're going to try to answer prior to the work session, when we're going to revisit more policy questions.
I'm sorry.
More from Evan.
Well, when you say, get these public improvements, I mean, people think, well, oh, the city's getting something. Well, the whole concept is that the higher intensity use creates a higher impact upon the public infrastructure, and so the applicant in developing this needs to offset those additional impacts by some sort of improvements to the system. Okay, so it's not like the city is reaping a windfall, it's the owner is mitigating the impacts to the system. Okay, people sometimes don't see that. I'm sure you guys do, but for the record, sorry.
You think that's why it wouldn't apply to a single family?
Well, when a single family is created, let's say a subdivision is created of single family lots, okay? We make the exaction at that time because we see there's going to be 8 single family homes that are going to go in. They have a certain amount of trips, they have a certain amount of parking requirements, a certain amount of pedestrians. So the exaction is made at the time of the subdivision. Now, if you're going to increase the intensity beyond what was assumed, we need to take another look at it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and well, I would also just point out that that is something that we've heard spelled out by DLCD is that, essentially cities aren't allowed to say, you can't develop here because there's insufficient infrastructure. There needs to be an opportunity for the developer to provide that infrastructure in areas where it may not exist currently. So that's kind of, that this may or may not be, something that, we would offer to developers, and just say, well, we have conditioning authority, but you can still do your development here, but you'll have to provide X, X, and X to, mitigate the increase in density. So again, a couple more questions that we'll need to get some more clarification from DLCD on the sort of reconstruction of non-conforming middle housing. Again, this is a situation that there's some existing middle housing in Lake Oswego, but I think it will be fairly rare for non-conforming middle housing that needs to be reconstructed. I think it'll be a unique circumstance, but we should still think it through and how it will all work. So that's something we'll visit at a later work session as well. And really, that wraps up my presentation. This is pretty, it's not the most exciting set of code amendments, but really just wanted to get this out of the way so that we can focus on some of the meatier, more policy-related questions later.
Thank you, Senior Planner Olson. Iris, was there anyone who wished to make public comment tonight?
No.
Since there's no one who wishes to make public comment, I'll close public comments now. Commissioners, questions for Erik and staff? Erik, I had one question. It kind of surprised me a little bit. When we were talking about applicability and Division 46, where middle housing must be required in any of the zones that allow single family. There was a zone that was the RW zone. I don't see that too much in Lake Oswego. I believe it's like the waterfront cabana zone or whatever. And we're saying that the waterfront cabana zone needs to allow middle housing. Can you explain that? What is that?
Yeah, I mean, any zone that currently allows detached single family housing, we need to make sure is compliant. So that is one where you can build detached single family housing. I think it's fairly unique circumstances, fairly small lot sites, but we want to make sure we're covering our bases. Yeah. Okay. And again, I think you could probably make a reasonable assumption that a waterfront cabana home would most likely be covered by the easement. And there might be a covenant or something of that that could prevent that from being constructed. But we still need to have it in our zoning that you can build middle housing. So,
thank you. Commissioners, any other questions? Excuse me, Commissioner Rigby.
Pardon me. So it looks like really most of this is. I mean, it was in the state's hands. It's out of our hands. We're just doing what must be done. Except for there were just kind of a couple of things where there's a little bit more leeway. And that was regarding whether to keep current rules regarding triplexes and up. Was that the only one?
So I think when it comes to those current rules for triplexes and up, we'd be talking about, conditioning authority perhaps, or, certain very specific elements of that, right? So I think the easiest way to explain it is that, there are certain things that are required by the state that we don't have much lenience, or that we don't have much flexibility on, and that's essentially, again, what we're hoping to cover today. I've tried to identify some outstanding policy questions just to kind of tee them up for later work sessions where we'll get into it a little bit more. But, I think it's not necessarily just what's in Division 46, but it's also that in combination with what we've heard from City Council and the Planning Commission as we've gone forward and sort of the decisions that have been made that have gotten us here. But yeah, that's, essentially I think there's a few questions here. I think most of the meaty questions we'll be getting into in the next couple of work sessions though.
Okay, great.
And I guess just to be broad, there's a lot more flexibility for us to regulate things like siting and design standards, a lot less flexibility for us to regulate things like density or the location of this middle housing. So I think these are a lot of these are density, location, things that we don't have much control over, and then those things where we do have flexibility will be the second and the third work sessions primarily.
Well, thank you. Commissioners, any further questions? All right. Thank you, Senior Planner Olson. So with that, I'd like to move on to the next agenda item. This is agenda item 8.1, Community Development Code Annual Amendment, LU 210057. This was really a follow-up from the discussion we had at our last meeting about the Saturday market temporary use and expanding the hours of that. Since our last meeting, it came to the attention of the commission that I think there's a lot of excitement in the community. The Park and Recs folks have done an excellent job at promoting the farmers market, and as we all know, it's like very, very successful. It's really an asset that's valued in the community, and so we received some feedback to say, could we take a look at this? Could we send a message to council to look at this a little bit more broadly, since there's so much excitement? I think what we were looking at was primarily centered just around the hours of use, but the feedbacks that the community, the neighborhood associations, the business groups in the Lake Grove area are very much interested in engaging and giving more feedback on this. And so the ask would be, could we, give direction to council from the commission to ask council to okay kind of a broader scope and convey the message that we've received from the community that we'd like to have this a little bit more broadly looked at than just the hours. Again, I think where this is coming from is just there's a lot of good things happening. The farmers market's tremendously successful. The community's put a lot of development efforts into the Lake Grove area, the road improvements, a lot of new developments there with the Mercado, the Springs. So it's kind of like generated a lot of excitement. And the ask was, could we send a message? So if the commission is okay with that, then I would support, kind of sending a message over to council to ask, make a request to expand the scope and looking at that. Director Siegel, is there anything that you would like to add for this?
Oh, thank you, Chair Heap. So the amendment that is part of the annual code changes that you looked at in your previous work session is proposing to expand the hours that the Saturday market could operate. And I think some of the buzz in the community, the excitement around this event has to do with the location of it and possibly where else it might occur and what programming might happen around a market in Lake Grove particularly. And I think those are all great topics for discussion. We've talked about this in terms of the the investment the city and the community have made into Lake Grove with the street, and it's nearing completion. And I think there's a lot of, I think our focus on economic development and community development initiatives in Lake Grove, will be a lot sharper now that we have a road project that's, nearing completion. I think on the one of the, I think, points that may be lost in all of this is that the land use, the community development code is, establishes rules around use of property, real property. And so in terms of a farmer's market or a Saturday market occurring on real property on a lot, that's where it controls. The market that was the pilot project, the market that occurred last spring, was on Hallmark Drive, which is a public right-of-way. And so technically that wouldn't be under the community development code. It's, the city can essentially, we would certainly do, public outreach and planning with the community before we would plan a festival or any kind of event to close down, that would require closing down a street. And I think that's part of what perhaps we're hearing from the community is we'd like to see, we'd like to see more markets like this. We'd like to see perhaps something that's even grander at some point. And if that were to happen in Lake Grove, we'd probably be looking at using the right-of-way, somewhere. It might be Boone's Ferry Road, might be, one of the other streets, but it wouldn't necessarily be subject to the community development code, which is a little bit, I know it's kind of wonky. It's like, we've got this code for Saturday markets, and it was developed around the market that we have at Millennium Plaza, which is on real property. It's on a lot, and so it was necessary to have zoning, requirements in order to authorize that. So kind of a roundabout way of saying, I think the Parks Department's request, and you've heard from them previously, is reasonable, and we'll certainly bring forward the code amendment that they've requested. But if the Planning Commission wanted to encourage the council, as you're suggesting, to explore programming on a larger scale and to look at this more holistically in Lake Grove, I'm sure that they would. It's not really a land use policy, but
Sure.
you could certainly
give the
communicate with the council on that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that would be the ask then is for the Plan Commission to basically give that message. It may be outside of the scope of what we do, but certainly, communicate back that we've heard that, folks are really excited. They, are excited about all the developments, the farmer's market, the new roads, and then ask council to look at, following up on that and expanding that. So send a message over to council to that effect. Commissioners, any comments or concerns? No? So I think that's it, and I'll work with staff and we'll send a message to that effect. All right. Schedule review, Director Siegel, is there anything you wanted to give us an update on schedule review?
Well, your next regularly scheduled meeting's in January, so happy holidays. I hope you all have a good winter break at least, or New Year. And I think your first meeting in January, we have the next work session on January 10th for House Bill 2001, and it's going to be all House Bill 2001 for the next 3 meetings, actually. We do have a hearing tentatively scheduled, or maybe officially scheduled at this point, on the annual Community Development Code amendments for January 24. So those are the next two items that'll cover your next 3 meetings.
All right, thank you. Director Siegel, when is the council reviewing their goals? Were they having a retreat, or what's the process they're following and the time frame for their goal review?
Yeah, the council goal setting retreat, I can bring up the date here for you on that. The city is collecting input through the community survey, so that's live right now, and if you haven't already completed it, it's online, I believe, the city website, and that's part of their goal setting process. Just give me a moment here and I'll bring up my calendar. Saturday, January 22nd is the City Council goal setting retreat. And so typically what happens there is they go through the input that they've received from the community. And so between now and then is, the time to provide input. They'll collect the advisory boards and commissions' recommended goals. So the goal setting that you did this evening is part of the packet that they receive and they consider in their work. And then shortly thereafter, usually, typically 1 or 2 meetings after that retreat, they'll adopt their goals or formalize their goals for the year. And they'll develop a list of projects or initiatives under each goal that the city manager, in consultation with the executive team, prepare for the council. So it's it's similar to what we're doing here, and kind of outlining the goals and then the tasks or projects to get there.
All right, great. Thank you. Meeting adjourned. Thanks, everyone. Good night.